This is one of the easiest MC gigs that I've had because I'm about to hand the reins over to Dr. Peta Miller, our keynote speaker. But before I do that, just a reminder that when we go to our panel later on, we'll be using Slido for questions. So please be thinking about your questions and get those coming in. After we hear from Peta, she'll be joined on the stage by Lachlan Denning from Anglicare and Dylan Ogilvie from Melcor Contracting. They're going to share with us some of the approaches that their organisations have been taking in the psychosocial space. So without further ado, Dr. Peta Miller is a highly respected health and human factors professional with over 40 years of experience in the private and public sectors, leading work health and safety strategy, policy practice, as well as research and evidence translation. She's got a deep knowledge of the Australian work health and safety legislative frameworks, particularly in preventing psychological and physical injuries. As a nationally recognised expert, she routinely works with Australian governments and regulators to develop national and jurisdictional work health and safety strategies and policies within leading private sector organisations. Over to you, Peta.
Thank you, and I was delighted to be invited to come today. I'm just going to check the text work. So we're all on a pathway, aren't we, towards doing better. Each one of us today are here because we know too many Australians are harmed at work. And the good news is that most of that is preventable. And today we're going to hear from me, but also more importantly from Sally and Dylan and Lachlan about some practical approaches. So today I wanted to just give you some context and some background. So I'm going to go through some of the journey, but first of all, importantly, I want to recognise the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here and are joining us online, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and state it always will be and always was Aboriginal lands. Sorry, get a bit emotional about that. Okay, so when I was thinking about this, I thought, well, the title that we discussed when we were talking about this event was We're on a Pathway. We're not there yet. We have a long way to go. But I also wanted to dispel some of the myths. Stress isn't a new concept. It's actually been around for hundreds and thousands of years as a documented issue. And so I thought I'd just do this little simple timeline of some of the key events where, way back in 480 BC, where the issues around combat stress were being acknowledged. And then I could have put in lots of examples, but they're some of the oldest ones we found. And then, more excitingly, towards 2000s, where the pace of understanding about what are psychosocial hazards and risks, what are the underlying causes of stress, how is it linked to health, safety and productivity, really began to pick up pace. And then from the 2011s to 2021, when most jurisdictions, including WorkSafe, did a lot of work developing tip sheets, tool sheets, so the information was getting out there. But what the regulators recognised that even though the Act actually had requirements to manage the risks to psychological and physical health, most people were just concentrating on physical health. And then from 2022 and onwards, we had further duty clarification. Because we're on a pathway, I started to think about, well, what might the future look like? And the future, in my view, will look like that health and safety, when we think about the hazards and risks, we will think about physical and psychosocial risks together because they're inextricably intertwined, that we will move towards controls that actually recognise that many controls will control the psychosocial hazards, but also some of the physical risks. And I suspect as we go forward over the next 10 to 20 years, as employers understand their duties more, the prosecutions in this area will also increase as community demands that we all do better. So let's just start with some dispelling some myths. We all break. If we're exposed to stress for too long and at too high levels, we will all break. It's not a matter of a lack of personal resilience. Organisations can and must do everything they reasonably can to control the risks that they generate. It's a natural human response when the demands exceed our capacity to cope. I like to just spend a little bit of time talking about the physiological impacts and the possible epigenetic impacts of stress. So we know now that acute stress has both immediate temporary cellular responses, but also hormonal responses. And these can happen within seconds or minutes of actually being exposed to a stress. We all know the state of our heightened arousal if we're feeling alarmed about or stressed by something at work. But we're also knowing now that the chronic stress exposure can lead to long-term cellular damage, sometimes even epigenetic changes. So they're changes that happen to our gene expressions. And these are particularly concerning for some shift workers. So I'm not going to dwell too much on this because I know many of you will be fully aware of this, but just reminding us all of that stress, the exposure, so psychosocial hazards when poorly controlled lead to stress, and stress has acute and chronic health impacts. We know about many of them, but I was talking with Associate Professor Carlo Caponecchi from UNSW, who has done some really interesting work, and he said, people get most of this sleep disturbance. We often recognise the psychological impacts, but we often forget, so even the gastrointestinal issues, how many of us when exposed to high levels of work pressure and stress actually feel nausea and vomiting. And, I've done some work where one of the signs of this person who had excessive workload was she was nauseated and vomiting, and in the end it led to a duodenal ulcer, increased risk for duodenal ulcer. There's also changed health behaviours, which are often blamed on the worker, but actually have some contributing work factors. So I'm a human factors person, so I also like to focus on some areas that I think don't currently get enough attention in workplaces. That exposure to stress can lead to serious cognitive and physical impairments. Now, I think historically we've all known about, if you have highly physically demanding work, you have hazardous manual tasks that are poorly controlled, the rates of MSD injury, musculoskeletal injuries go up. But when stress is high, you can have up to a 50% slower cognitive reaction time and accuracy. This has safety implications. We have attention tunnelling, so we narrow our attention, we start missing some of the situational signals. And this is what the regulators when they say psychosocial hazards and risks don't just cause psychological injuries, they actually lead to physical. So think about somebody who's doing a high-risk task and they're under pressure and they're feeling stressed. They'll narrow their attention, but will they miss some of the other cues around that they may be danger? We'll start to shed tasks. That could be a good thing. Or it could be a poor thing if we're shedding tasks that actually were important to safety or performance. Our concentration, our memory really starts to erode. And the higher the stress, we know it ourselves, don't we? How we start getting befuddled when we're under stress. What also happens is we start to potentially have erosion to our organised thinking. We lean more heavily on training, which is a good thing if the training is good and it's delivered by competent people and we've retained it. But if that training is too far away from the time when we need it, maybe we're using poor quality shortcuts to actually reduce our mental load. So, and there's also a group dynamics change. So we tend to have what's called deference to power. So we might just, whatever, we'll just go with the leading voice, the person who's expressing the strongest, noisiest opinion. And so often the introverts in the group who may have actually really important thoughts to contribute to safety and health get overlooked. And so we need to actually be really thinking about the group dynamics. And of course we know about the changes to muscle strength and endurance. So when you go back and you're talking to your managers and your workers, please take time to take a little bit extra consideration for what might be happening to the erosion of cognition because stress leads to errors, slips, laps, mistakes, and workarounds and rule violations. And stress leads to poor performance, and poor performance itself is stressful. So there's a vicious cycle that's going on. So we all know personally that stress impairs our emotional resilience and has serious behavioural consequences. So we'll know about the flight and fight. But one of the things that happens, and workers are often blamed, is emotional reactivity. And the Minister was actually talking about the scenarios with the HSRs, the Human Health and Safety reps. So when we're highly alarmed and alert, we get far more emotionally reactive. We don't react with the calmness and consideration. We revert to those mental shortcuts, which may or may not be positive. And we also see a significant increase in disruptive behaviours, so that there's far more group conflict, less tolerance. And one of the things that will often happen is people they have less emotional and intellectual effort available, so they decrease their willingness to spend effort. So that's when you'll see people saying, no, I'm not going to help out. I'm not going to volunteer for the extra shift. No, I'm not going to put my hand out, which may be perceived as people being resistant and difficult, but they're just trying to preserve and protect themselves. And really importantly, since we all know that effective communication is the heart of a good, safe and productive workplace. But communication really erodes when people are under stress, and we reduce the trust in ourselves and others. So, and as I said, stress will impair performance, and poor performance is highly stressful. Yet how often is one of the triggers for actually looking at a situation because of underperformance? So before you go straight into thinking that it's the worker's individual problem, take the opportunity, if it's an underperformance issue, to look back at what are some of the causes that may have been contributing to that poor behaviour. So what are psychosocial hazards and risks? And I'm going to whiz through this because I'm sure you've all read the code really thoroughly, but I just wanted to remind you all that there are aspects of the work, task and situations at work that may cause stress and fatigue. And I don't think it's particularly useful to separate stress and fatigue. I think they're really so interlinked we can consider them in the same group. And importantly, they can lead to psychological harm and physical harm. And I'm going to keep repeating that they're so linked to the risks of physical harm, we shouldn't ignore them. In fact, some regulators across Australia, and I know we've been talking about it I was talking about it with the regulators yesterday, will consider psychosocial hazards as almost the bedrock of everything else, because if you get that right, then everything else becomes a little easier. So all hazards interact, they all combine. And the more and the longer they're present, the higher the risk of both psychological and physical injuries. But the good news is, is that safer design and better management can actually moderate the risks significantly. People, and perhaps some of you are here because you're saying, I don't know what to do, I want some answers. And as I'm going to keep repeatedly saying, it's actually not that difficult. What we need to do is work with workers to actually identify what's really causing the stress, get their suggestions, and then flip it around. And essentially, that's good work design. So the likelihood of work-related psychological harm is multifactorial. We need to actually really think about duration, so how long, how often, how high, and how these all might combine to create the problems. So you might have something that is a high exposure but only occurs once, or you might have low-grade exposures that are just cumulative. So if you think about workloads that are high and then people have a recovery time, maybe that's not an issue. But if they're perpetually high, it becomes an issue. What I really want to reinforce that there are many sources of psychosocial hazards and risks. And as we're on our pathway to improve our risk management, we need to expand the lens that we look at. I think historically we've typically focused on just tasks, and we need to look where else are these emerging from. So I'd encourage you to actually think about all of the sources. As I said, often people just thought about tasks and hazards, but there are organisational factors, how the organisation is structured, the governance arrangements, the culture. People will often focus on that, but not the structure of the organisation. There are some tasks that are inherently hazardous. The employer has a duty to still manage those so far as reasonably practical. And we're going to be hearing from Dylan and Lachlan, particularly Lachlan, about dealing with inherently hazardous work environments and how you can design work better. There are processes and systems, how the work is organised and managed. And we know that they're often a source of great frustration to workers. But if designed well, they can really help alleviate some of the stress. And working environments, the building plants and structures. And you might be saying, why are you putting these in? We're talking about psychosocial hazards and risks. But I remember talking to Professor Dr. Sam Harvey, who's a psychiatrist who I've done some work with, and I can see one of my colleagues nodding. And when we first started working together some 15 years ago, he said, why are you putting that in, Peter? And I said, because, well, imagine being a worker on a construction site with insufficient fall arrest. Do you think that might increase their stress? And I now notice with pleasure that he actually specifically talks about the stressors, the psychological stressors that come from working in a poorly designed physical environment where it's noisy and loud and unpleasant. So there are social relationships and how people in the team cultures. And I'm going to talk more about people's innate characteristics and skills and characteristics. So I urge you on your pathway to more mature responses that broaden your lens. Make sure your lens is looking at all of those groups to identify the root causes and the multiple sources, because that gives you multiple opportunities of intervention rather than a single source of trying to generate change. So systematically understanding which hazards and risks are present in your workplace for your workers at a particular time period creates the opportunities for you to design safer work. And I'm going to keep reiterating that's about your workplaces and your people. And you know your business and you know your people, and your people will know the things that are stressing them or could make work easier. So while the regulators have done a fantastic job doing general guidance with the psychosocial codes and the tip sheets, you'll get your best insights by talking to the people who really bear the risks and who do the work, your own workers. So I just want to draw your attention to some company-wide issues to consider. So again, reiterating that your solutions need to be specific to your industry. What's appropriate for an education setting will be different from a healthcare or a mining sector. So you need to do your systematic processes to work out what's going on with you. It'll depend on your services and your goods and processes that you are doing. And I've put a range of other things for you to talk about. We do need to touch on industrial relations issues, staffing, the adequacy of staffing, and your staffing history and how you're managing those. Your retention policies and procedures. I mean, one of the big things we're going to be talking about is workload pressures, and at the root of that is insufficient staffing. You need to consider organisational issues. So there are some issues. The good thing about when you look at these, there are some things that are going to apply to all your workforce. So there'll be that organisational leave, and that might be how you're structured in your governance arrangements and your general policies and procedures. And if you address those, then you're going to be helping most of your workers. And then there are going to be things that drill down into the specific tasks and jobs. So I've put some questions to ask yourself. I know that WorkSafe will be providing you with PDFs of these slides, so I'm not going to actually spend too much time on these. So poorly designed systems and poorly designed applied systems are one of the most commonly reported sources of stress and frustrations for workers. So very often we'll see less mature organisations just relying on policies and procedures. But the fundamental issue if these actually aren't fit for purpose. So there are a range of common job-specific psychosocial hazards. They're outlined in the code, and I'm just listing some of those for you to consider. But think about them generally in terms of the ones that are cumulative, that are, they're there and they build up over time, and those that are one-off but highly stressful, including being exposed to traumatic events. I'm going to dwell a little bit on a couple of these as I go through that come up in the surveys as being the most commonly concerned. So, and also want to say that low workload, where work is boring and monotonous, particularly where you've got to be vigilant and watching for things, is also highly stressful as well. So while we kind of focus on the high workloads, low workloads are an issue too, though less obviously one for people. So long working hours and shift work. The ILO and WHO came out in 2023 with a really important piece of work that looked at the causes of death and illness that were work-related. And one of the really important things for us to think about with working hours is that long periods of working over 55 hours a week are associated with a significant increase in the risk of death from a whole range of causes, and a significant risk of illnesses and injuries. So as soon as you've got long periods of 55 hours plus, then you need to actually be thinking about what are you going to be doing to actually improve the rest and recovery. So there are some tasks, long working hours and shift works are inherently demanding, and we know, we're going to hear from Melchor and others, and many of you will come from industries with shift work. And some of the things that will impact the demand and then so the stress and strain that workers experience are around this work design, the total hours, the predictability. Predictability is really important for people to be able to plan their rest and recovery and to take leave and to have adequate sleep and recovery. So I also want to talk about mentally demanding work. Again, I drew earlier the thing that this is an under-focused area currently, I think, in Australia. So what we're talking about is cognitive mental demands. So that's the information processing demands, the perception, the attention, the memory, the problem solving, the decision making. And all of us have mental demands in our work, and it's increasing. And yet, how often are we actually asking our workers about, tell me about the mental demands in your work and how we can make them less. So the mental demands will increase with complexity and task pressure, need for vigilance, interruptions and disruptions, etc. And when we have inadequate information training and supervision. Emotionally demanding work is another area that's frequently not given enough attention. I see in the code that it's now we're asked to focus on it. So and Lachlan's going to talk about the significant emotional demands for his staff, and many of us, unfortunately, are experience abuse and rudeness and incivility, and sometimes aggression and violence. These can be inherent tasks of the work, but the duty still is that we must do everything so far as reasonably practical to manage them. And we can't just say it's part of the job and you've got to pick it up, put up with it. There's also an emerging concept of emotional labour. So think how often work demands that we display empathy and caring and calmness and maybe even a set of values. So think about a salesperson. And if there's a dissonance, there's a gap between what we're feeling internally with our own value system and what we're needing to provide, the stress increases significantly. So we think about that also as an under-focused area. As a human factors person, I really want you to think about the consequences of errors. As soon as the impact, whether it's on yourself, your own safety, your co-workers' safety, or even the machine, and I sit on the Australian Radiation Nuclear Protection Advisory Committee as a human factors person, and there's an industry with high consequences if things go wrong. And so the worry and fear around actual or perceived, and maybe they're not correctly perceived, impact of errors is really high. So check out what the impact are and if people are perceiving that as an issue. So we've talked about physically demanding tasks and high-risk hazardous work environments where there are poor controls, which is why, in construction and mining, those physical controls are an inherent part of safe work. The isolated and remote work is something that many Western Australians have to do. It's part of the demands of your large state. And I know that in Melcor, they're going to talk about the importance of reducing isolation and improving social support and emotional support and practical support if working in an isolated or remote environment is part of what they need to do. So low job control, and particularly I like to talk about where there's goal conflicts. So the literature tells us very clearly that one of the most stressful things is if you don't have actually the ability to control things. So think about somebody on a process manufacturing line with set speed. They can't control the speed of the process line, but they're responsible for quality. And somebody says, "Oh, be safe. Don't hurt your arm or your shoulder, and don't get stressed by this, but you better not make a mistake because actually if a product comes off the line and is faulty, we'll have big troubles." And I'm going to talk about reward and recognition later. And we all like task variety, and as I'm going to finish in the end with saying this is one of the things that you can variety creates more interesting work, helps people build their skills, and people find that that's part of your journey to go beyond the minimum into highly and more desirable work. So I want to talk about emotional support. That's probably one of the things that people go first to, but think about, is it being delivered in the style and the frequency and by trusted people? When I want emotional support, I want it from people who I respect and in a way that suits my style. So you need to be checking that you and your staff are getting it the way they want. Who's giving it to them and how is it being given? And that there's appropriate thanks and recognition. It's a little thing that can do, but so often people say, I'm putting in all this extra work, I'm doing the extra hours. It's a really challenging way. I'm being yelled at by clients and nobody's telling me thank you. So I really want to talk about practical support. So this is around being very clear for people around getting the information they need, the training they need, the supervision and the instruction around what does good look like? How do I apply these policies and procedures you're expecting me to follow? Not just safety ones, but also how to do the job to a high quality standard. What's the performance expectations you expect from me? One of the research findings is often there's a disturbingly high number of employees who have performance agreements that don't match actually what they do. So then there's an opportunity for conflict with supervisors and for unnecessary confusion. Poor work and tools. As a human factors person, I want to remind us all that we need the tools. We all use some sort of tools for work and they have to be fit for purpose. They have to fit our people. The anthropometrics need to be right. They need to fit what needs the fit for purpose to deal with expected and the unexpected issues that might arise in your environment and fit for your site. when you are introducing new tools and work materials, they have a huge potential to be a source of psychosocial hazard if they're not fit for people, not fit for purpose and not fit for your site. So make sure you've done appropriate consultation during the design, from the concept through to design, and user trials. And so I'd also kind of urge you to actually have a look at the new tools and whether the introduction of AI, robotics and others are actually being delivered effectively. Poor working relationships and inadequate communication are a common source of stress, and we're going to hear a little bit more from our other speakers about it. And they're a red flag for an increased risk of bullying. So all forms of bullying and harassment, including sexual harassment, can be influenced by these, but one-off events can also be harmful. But the poor work design and management cultures, I would argue, set the scene for unacceptable behaviours to flourish. So they might start with some just incivility and some unacceptable, less serious behaviours, and if they're not stomped on, escalate. There's a range of work individual factors, the reality is, that do affect people, and I know that Dylan's going to actually talk a lot about how they recognise that and deal with that. But the PCBU's responsibility is limited to their ability to control the work-related factors, and we hear employers often get quite anxious about, but I can't, I'm not responsible for somebody's marriage breakup. No, you're not. But you are responsible for doing everything reasonably practical for the work factors that contribute to it, and to make some reasonable adjustments where you can. So there's some 3 stress models that I wanted to touch on. I'm only going to fly through these, but really just to say that these are understood and recognised by regulators. So take the time after this to go and explore them. The first is the job demand control support model, came out in the 90s, so you stood the test of time. And basically these all models all say that good job designs have moderate to high levels of demand, so you don't want to have a boring job, but they have high levels of job control and high levels of support. Then later on, as the models matured, some additional job resources models came in, the job demands resources model, and in it said, just make sure that you, in order to reduce the demands and optimise organisational outcomes, you increase social, practical and instrumental support. And the greater the imbalance, the more likelihood. And remembering that the benefits are going to be highest when demands are high. And just touching on effort and reward, as I said earlier on, rewards do matter. I'm back a bit. Rewards do matter, but rewards aren't just financial. So people may get tense about that, but they're judged against parity. So if you know that somebody else is putting in an equal effort, but they're a different effort and they're being paid more or less than you, that matters, and it's judged against society's expectations. So have a think about effort reward. So what are those pathways for those in control to design better work? Well, obviously, effective work health and safety risk management is just good work design and effective risk management, and your code outlines a whole range of things. So we're going to encourage you to systematically identify and assess the critical hazards and risks. And I'm going to talk about using systems thinking. So what's happening? How are these hazards interacting? Who's impacted and why? So drill down deeper. Keep asking. A good technique is the 5 whys. Why is this happening? And who's making the critical design decisions that are impacting this? And we want you to employ evidence-based approaches to controlling risk by continuously looking at work design and management practices. I'm sure that Sally's going to tell you when an inspector comes in, they don't want to see that somebody's written some policies and procedures and it's a set and forget. What they want to see is a dynamic process where the hazards and stresses are being monitored and you are responding so far as practical in real time and introducing controls that are suitable for that situation. So we want you to be systematically reviewing those. And one of the flags for me is that your senior board, your management team will actually be looking at them. So the legal minimum is that you will control the risks using an appropriate mix. So I'm just going to do a quick thing about hierarchy of control. It's a useful tool. It's not in your code. But what we want to say is your first duty is, look at ways to eliminate. And there are a range of suggestions in the code and the other resources that WorkSafe have that can suggest that. I'm going to touch on some very quickly. But then you're never going to eliminate everything, are you? So you need to actually look at the best mix for your organisation and your workers of controls of substituting, so looking at safer ways of working, isolating, which might be engineering controls, safer systems of work. You're going to need to use the combination of those rather than just one. A red flag that other regulators tell me about, Sally will tell me if it is one for you, is if you're only relying on training and policies and procedures and not looking at all your other options. So I just want to say something about information training and instruction and supervision. So you need to be providing this for all of those ways. What does working safer look like? How would you operate an engineering control? What are the safety procedures, particularly for high-risk work? And what about the PPE, how to use it? So it's about how to do their job safely and well, and make sure you're providing that and it's adequate and it suits the individual at all circumstances. And you've got to maintain and review. So I'm going to just, way back in 2014, I wrote this. I used to work for Safe Work Australia for 18 years, and I wrote, and this is part of our pathways, isn't it? So you can see how old this is that we wrote a document on work design. There was a project that was subsequently done by Safe Work New South Wales, where I wrote a work design guide for them, which unpacked it in more detail. And I believe that it's available on your website, so I urge you to go and look at that more deeply. So here's some tips for how to design work better. First of all, engage the decision makers at all levels. It's not just the CEO. The CEO makes some decisions, but so does the HR manager. So does the manager of information resources. So does the team leader. So there's a whole range. So does the manager for building and maintenance. So there are a whole range of people who are making decisions across the organisations that can directly or indirectly impact work. And many of you are going to be work health and safety professionals, as I am. Look, one of the things I think we haven't done in the past is work closely enough with HR. The HR leader is going to be in charge of recruitment and retention policies and maybe the training. If we don't work better together and use each other's skills, we're missing things. So you also need to be applying better systems thinking, and I'm going to talk more about controlling risks at source. Using systems thinking is one of your most powerful keys to go to a more mature approach, further along your pathway, to understand your hazards and risks and the effectiveness of your existing controls. You might have some that are terrific, and you may have some that you think are working that aren't. So using the iceberg analogy, some things will be obvious if you just do a superficial look, but there will be great learnings in going below the surface. So you need to understand, and those making design decisions and management decisions, that work is complex. You're looking in multiple interacting issues that are impacting your business pressures, your workers, the situations. And using root cause analysis systems thinking can help you identify those things above the waterline and those below that can be implication for the organisation, for teams and at-risk individuals. I just want to touch on organisational resilience and individual resilience, because we were talking recently in WorkSafe about people talk about building personal resilience. That's fantastic. That's at the individual level. What we want is, if you're designing and managing work, is organisational resilience, so that you're focusing on just not one individual worker but whole groups of workers, and you're getting the maximum bang for your buck when you're actually making work design and management decisions. So you'll be making it better for everybody, just not the one at-risk worker. So I've got a slide here that's really mainly for your use later on, to actually think about the power of a root cause analysis. So if we just looked at example in, say, a community care setting of a staff being assaulted, and just said, well, they developed PTSD and there was a poor post-incident, a critical incident response, and that was it. And actually we didn't have good enough policies. You've missed all these wonderful opportunities that sit behind it, that were the root causes behind the failure. So I urge you to actually go deeper, to look beyond the tip of the iceberg into the deeper causes, and you can use that by using simple systems thinking approaches which are in that guide, or even simple ones like the 5 ways. So I just wanted to quickly touch on a couple of examples of design options for common hazards. Again, they must be specific to your organisation, your situation, your context and your people. But let's all see an increased maturity in WHS accountability by your management team. WHS in performance metrics, genuine conversations with real metrics in the board, appropriate recruitment, realistic staffing models. If we don't get the staffing models right, then we're behind the 8 ball again. Good organisational change. How often is organisations have to change all the time, but it's how that change is managed. We know you're all going to be evolving over time. It's how that change is communicated with everyone. One of the things that we passionately urge you to do is better project planning and management. When we look at what are some of the root causes of stress for workers, it's that the avoidable issues could have been dealt with by better planning up front, and that there was inadequate project planning for a new IT system, a new build, even a new service delivery model. Think about how your site is designed, particularly around layouts and tools and technology. And evidence-based interventions. Often we see, unfortunately, organisations using their precious financial resources and time on interventions that aren't evidence-based. Look at the workload management techniques. Are there good team workload and project and task planning going on? This will be an extremely powerful work design tool. Clear task prioritisation. People always have peaks and troughs. What things can go, what things can be put off till later, what things must actually be done. What are the performance barriers? When I did my own PhD a long time ago, actually after everything else had been added in, the most powerful stressors and causes of job dissatisfaction and even muscle pain was actually performance impediments. When people said there were things they could have done that just got in the way. I just want to come and do my job, but the equipment didn't work. I didn't have the materials I needed. I didn't have the information I needed. Joe was slow in giving me doing his bit, and I couldn't finish my work on time. And now I'm being blamed. So take the time to ask people, what are the performance barriers? Work design isn't simple, isn't complex. The people who know the hazards are the ones doing the jobs. Just ask them. There are multi-dimensional occupational violence, bullying and harassment risk management is needed. You're going to need senior management commitment, governance and accountability. And you need to do prevention through better work design, organisational work design and management. And then fair, and this is in the code, fair incident investigation evidence management. This is a really stressful process for everybody, and so you need to take particular care with it. So, but that's the minimum, and the code will give you tips and on how to delve deeper. And I urge you, there's also some free tools like the People at Work Psychosocial Risk Assessment tool, which is a wonderful free digital assessment. If you have 20 or more workers, you can use that to help identify the psychosocial hazards at risk, the at-risk teams, and there's a whole lot of fantastic resources on it. It's funded by the regulators. They don't get the identified data. They only get industry-level data. So it's a terrific tool. So let's think about, now you've got along that pathway, what might go beyond. And you will see a lot of people focus on this, but I'm going to urge you first, make sure you're compliant, then go beyond the minimum. So we all would love to have more satisfying work by optimising the opportunities to do meaningful work. It's not actually a requirement, but it's a great thing to have. So if you want to move beyond the minimum, think about how you can create more meaning and purpose and achievement, give people more autonomy and control, better relationships, and the Blue Trail initiative is a fantastic example of how to build positive, supportive relationships and work-life balance. And I think I've finished on time.